Well, I was really impressed with the students. Very impressed with how many people were interested in water issues, and especially the Nile Basin, which of course is what we were here to talk about.
It's a real pleasure visiting Future University in Egypt. As a representative of the University of Central Florida, we are honored to be in partnership with FUE, and having talked to students and engaged in dialogue, it's as impressive as everything I've heard about the university. The students are extremely inquisitive, and they're learning very important lessons about public diplomacy, contemporary issues, and learning really how to think in a critical fashion.
Very impressed with the questions and the level of interest the students showed. I really appreciated so many of them coming out, and we had a very lively and vibrant discussion. I hope can come back again in the future. The third, and I think most important one, though, and this kind of loops back to the issues that many of you are thinking about and studying as political science and international relations majors, is security. This is something that David got mentioned quite a lot in his comments about sort of the region as a whole. But in many ways, the reason that there are so many sort of water resource issues here in the Middle East is that there's kind of a deficit of security in many countries. And again, in Yemen, part of the reason that it's been so difficult to address water scarcity there is just simply that there's a complete lack of security in the country. It's very difficult to build water supply infrastructure, maintain it, let alone do something like trying to create a water market or trying to raise the price of water. This is also, and this is sort of gets to the final part of what I want to say. This is also the reason why I think the Nile issue is so difficult. In many ways, you could think of some very practical economic ways to address kind of the tensions between Egypt and its upstream neighbors over the Nile. If Ethiopia wants to build a dam to develop its economy, there's in principle no reason why there shouldn't be able to be an agreement for Ethiopia to compensate Egypt for any negative impact that it might have on the flow of the Nile downstream. But of course, that's pretty impractical, and the reason for that is that there's a complete lack of trust, right, between the two governments. There's a very tortured history between the two countries. There's a lot of tension. There's a lot of politics. And I think fundamentally the reason that all of those barriers persist over time is that you have a real kind of lack of security and stability in the region. So I think in a lot of ways, water resource issues and sort of conflict over water reflects those dynamics of mistrust that are much more pervasive than even a geopolitical kind of perspective would indicate. So I don't want to go on for too long here, but I would just like to sort of conclude by saying I think that conflict over water in general and conflict over the Nile in particular could both be really sort of advanced and pushed along if you think about the problem not just as one that sort of takes place at the international nation-state level and from a geopolitical perspective where countries are always locked in conflict, but one in which there are some potential economic solutions that may not be entirely practical now, but that you could see that possibly in a few years, if you build a climate of trust and improve the security situation in the region, that potentially an economic solution could play a big role in ensuring that this kind of long-standing tension is relieved. So I'll stop there because I think, as David said, it's more interesting for both you and for us to have discussion. So let's get into that, and we'll talk about whatever you all are interested in. Thank you.
Before we go into discussion, it's actually a question for you. We're talking about cooperation, building trust, right? In settling, managing conflict over water. It would be helpful for us if you have examples of conflicts over water between countries, upper and lower ends in the river. How did they do it? So we can also understand in terms of our relations with Ethiopia. Just before we open for discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very good question, and the sort of a two-part answer. One thing that I didn't mention, but perhaps should have, is that actually there's a fair amount of research on warfare or violent conflict over water. And the conclusion is that it's actually extremely rare. So there are, depending on who you trust or whoever is doing the study, there are either no identifiable instances where water has kind of caused a war between countries, or very few. People, classify wars differently in terms of how they started. But so they're quite rare. Instances of cooperation are much easier to identify, and I think one that's relevant to the Nile, although it takes place in a very different context, is the Colorado River, which is shared between the United States and Mexico. And almost all of the river is within the U.S., but there's a little portion of the river that empties out through Mexico. It, since the late 1800s, has been one of Mexico's most important agricultural areas. It's all irrigation, but it's very productive. Starting in the early 20th century, though, the river water that came from the U.S. down into Mexico became very saline, and that's just because of poor irrigation practices in the U.S. But basically, it was too salty to be effective for irrigation once the water reached Mexico. So Mexico, over a period of a couple decades, complained to the United States about this, and the kind of important thing to emphasize in this example is that you have this upstream, downstream kind of issue where Mexico, in a lot of ways, again, if you sort of look at it from a zero-sum geopolitical perspective, Mexico is effectively powerless because it just has to sort of take the water that flows down from the United States. But Mexico raised this to the top of kind of the diplomatic agenda every time the president of Mexico went to the United States. He would talk about this issue and say, this is really a big deal for us, this is really hurting our farmers, we want you to do something about it. And at one point, the president of Mexico came on a state visit to the United States and told President Nixon, if you don't fix this problem, we will not have a relationship with you. So essentially made it a core kind of national interest and made that clear to the United States. And that did prompt the United States to act. The United States invested $100 or so million in what was at the time the world's largest desalination plant to clean the water so that it was fresh when it reached Mexico. So I think that's a possible example of how you can get countries who are sort of oriented upstream and downstream and do have a history of political conflict over water to cooperate. And I think the lesson there is, first of all, the downstream country making water a kind of core national interest, but even more importantly, making that clear. Now it has to be said, the situation, that example isn't entirely relevant to the case of the Nile, both because Egypt has this sort of long-standing history of tension with Ethiopia that has sort of exceeds what was the case with the U.S. and Mexico. But nonetheless, I think it does show that kind of cooperation is possible.
I want to mention one thing, just in looking at water problems in general, and that is sometimes it's actually easier to look at a potential solution than to go to where you need to begin, which is identifying the exact nature of the problem. And one problem that exists is there is a reluctance of nations to share data on water. This is global. It's not just particular to this region, because this is a national security concern. So sometimes you actually don't want to show your cards. You know, Americans like to use poker metaphors, so I'm going to continue to use them. But you don't like to show your cards because this actually gives away how much leverage you have, and that's the perception. So even for the initiative that the University of Central Florida started, we had NASA scientists come and participate at the conference who manage not just data for American water issues, but for worldwide. And they can only share some data because it's classified even in the United States. It's not being able to share data is a difficult thing. And then when you look at some of the challenges, a lot of the approaches that have been adapted, a lot of the experiments that have been adapted in water management are more of a national origin than a regional origin. Again, this is because the nature of relations between states. Sometimes it can work through treaties, but it's often very difficult because of the data issue.
We'd like very much to welcome our two distinguished speakers again, and the rule is, let us entertain them with questions. Student first, then faculty later. So we start taking questions.
I think we have 70% of the world water from seas. I heard about Saudi Arabians did a program to make the seawater.
Desalination.
Yeah. So, what about these programs? We can use it or not, or it's going to be a good thing, or a good idea or not?
In Egypt?
In Saudi Arabia, and the whole,
Generally speaking.
Sure. Well, it's absolutely essential that desalinization is part of the solution. But the problem is it is not the only solution. And there's a couple aspects of looking at it. One is again, Egypt has a challenge with its budget, for example. Saudi Arabia doesn't have the same challenge for the moment. So Egypt could never run a desalinization program, even if it needed to, like Saudi Arabia, because it's so enormously costly. Okay? And the way that they've done it right now, all but just the last two are use traditional fossil fuels, use oil to produce the water. And you're using more oil than you get water in return. Oil is an export item for Saudi Arabia. That fills the budget. So it's actually extremely costly. It's part of the solution, yes, and it's an absolute necessity given the fact that just a couple things to consider. This is actually a regional problem. Demographic change increases pressure on water supply. When we look at Saudi Arabia, we're talking about a country in 1970 that was 4 million. That's 28 million today. That's a lot more demand for water. Forget even the agricultural aspects and other things, although agriculture is the #1 user of water in the kingdom. So it's part of the solution, but it's not the only thing. I mean, what are other parts of the solution? It's how they catch runoff when it does rain. Okay? Right now in Saudi Arabia, they have a very ineffective program of catching that. So most of that water, for example, in Jeddah, which does get rain sometimes, most of that goes right into the sea. So you're losing an opportunity there. Then you have questions of sewage treatment. 70% of sewage from Jeddah, Governor, goes right back into the sea. Okay? You can recycle some of that water. And if you talk to some Saudi officials and experts, they say you can actually clean it up to the point that it can be used for clean drinking water. So that should be the focus, not desalinization, or have a combination where at least half is recycled water, which is also sometimes called brown water, but where that's more part of the solution than that. Then there's also how you change practices on agriculture. Drip agriculture is kind of, as the Saudi minister said a couple of years ago, more crop, less drop. It's kind of an approach. So there's a combination of ways to approach it. Desalinization can't be the only thing. And the Saudis have over-relied on this. That's the only answer. And, you know, kind of the wisdom is they focused on the actual building of plants, not the usage of water. And Scott mentioned the price and things like that. You have to look at the actual water supply, not just desalinization plants.
Yeah, great question. It's obviously probably the single most kind of important issue in terms of the solution, particularly in the MENA region. The other thing that, just to kind of mention, because it is very important, is that a lot of the water issues in the Middle East more or less have to do with groundwater depletion. So the kind of growth in both population and agricultural production in the last 30 to 40 years in almost every country across the MENA region has been basically as a result of groundwater pumping. So you know, even in a country like Egypt, which is blessed with the Nile doesn't provide enough water to entirely account for agricultural production. A lot of that is fed by groundwater pumping, and the problem with groundwater pumping is that if you take more water out than is replenished by rain or from a river or whatever, then you lower the groundwater table. And at a certain point, it becomes very difficult to pump that water out. You have to dig some places in the Middle East, especially in the Arabian Peninsula. You can dig 100 meters or more before you reach the water table. And at that point, actually, the water that you're drawing out was deposited thousands, in some cases even millions of years ago, when the climate was very different. So it's water that once you take it out will never come back in. And that's really the biggest issue. Desalination can't really replace that, at least right now. Can't fully replace groundwater. And the reason is, as David said, it's just too expensive right now, especially for agriculture. Desalination is really useful for like supplying cities and drinking water, things like that. But at the moment, it's way too expensive. And there are technologies out there that are lowering the cost quite a bit. But the problem is that it still takes a lot of energy to convert salt water to fresh water, and that is sort of almost like a thermodynamic problem. You will never reach a point in which it's cheap and easy. But it might be cheap enough that you could use it for some agricultural uses, just probably won't be enough. So the point is, even with a lot of investment in desalination, you still have this big problem in agriculture. And as David said, somehow you have to figure out how to get a lot more crop for using much less water. And desalination will